Good afternoon, everybody. Today I came here to speak basically about freedom of panorama and why it is important not only for everyday activities but for the very preservation of our history itself. Actually, it was good that on the previous session Ryan Merkley already he said the very right thing, that freedom of panorama seems to be like the very basic exception to the copyright, and it really is in the age when everybody of us has a high definition camera with him all the time, or even not the one camera. But first of all, I want to make some disclaimers, as this presentation will touch some ideological stuff. I need to say that I do not intend to promote any ideologies or something like that, and the very visual style of my presentation is not intended to promote anything as well. It's just a visual style. And certainly I am speaking here as a private person. Why I came to be interested in freedom of panorama in particular. Back in 2015, Ukrainian parliament passed a law with this very long title, but everyone in Ukraine basically calls it the law on decommunization. What is important regarding copyright and freedom of panorama is that this law, among many other things, it basically requires municipalities to dismantle monuments to the people of communist regime and dedicated to some historical dates or something like that. But here is like a small statistic for the 2.5 years now when this law is in place. In Ukraine, it around 2,500 monuments, like statues, were dismantled, and from them around half to Vladimir Lenin alone. But the main concern for me in all this history is that monument, it's not a well-defined term, because it's not only the statues like this. It's basically any something big and available in public places to see. Something like this. And here we see actually a good example of a Soviet monument which is dedicated to some, I believe, to the revolution, and you can see some signs of Soviet regime, hammer and sickle, for instance. And it would have seemed that everything should be okay for preservation of heritage, because the law has like this clause that the requirement to dismantle shall not affect like the works of art which already exist, but as it comes almost always with legal things, it's not only important what the law says, it's also very important how the law is interpreted and how it is enforced. And it came out that municipalities tend just to dismantle well, everything which has like some Soviet signs, like hammer and sickle. And yes, and here is the thing, that monuments are dismantled. Well, that's a question of policy, and it's a political decision. But we need to think that so these monuments are documents of the past, and when they are dismantled, it makes sense to preserve them at least in some form, in digital form maybe, or something like that. But Ukraine does not have a freedom of panorama of any kind in its copyright law, and no substitute like fair use or so. And it's quite strange, because well, absence of freedom of panorama in some country seems to me quite strange, and I made small research in the end of the last year. I just reviewed copyright laws of all European countries, and it's 44 countries at the time according to the United Nations, and only 6 of these countries do not have any freedom of panorama. That's Ukraine, Italy, and I believe Andorra, Monaco, and San Marino. Nevertheless, there are some examples in Ukraine of projects which try to preserve this heritage, to digitize it, notwithstanding the absence of freedom of panorama. They basically just disregard these potential risks. First of these projects is a non-commercial project, Soviet MOSAICS in Ukraine. It is a project of Izolatia Fund. It's an art fund which was founded like many years ago back in Donetsk, where they had their main place of exhibitions, but then when the conflict started, they eventually moved to Kiev. And this their project, it's available online. They have like images of more than 1,000 monumental Soviet mosaics. And here is another project. That's the art book of one of Ukrainian photographers, and it includes like photos of Soviet mosaics as well, obviously, and it's commercially available. But yeah, I said that these projects, they just disregard potential liability. According to our Ukrainian laws, there could be different types of liability for copyright infringement, which making of these photographs of old abandoned mosaics is, and it's damages, but maybe it's not the worst of the possibilities, as the second option is compensation, like statutory damages, and they could range from anywhere from 100 to 5 million euros, and that's counting that average wage in Ukraine at the time is 200 euros, so quite substantial sums. And then surely there are even criminal charges could be made. So obviously that's not what the law should be, and it definitely should be solved. So the natural solution seems to be to add freedom of panorama exception to the copyright law. And back in 2014, Wikimedia Ukraine, they drafted an amendment to introduce freedom of panorama, but then when they started public discussion of this draft, it just so happened that this draft was submitted to the parliament before the public discussion was completed, so it's not of the best quality, let's say. And it basically proposes to allow to take pictures of the works of some types, most notably architecture and statues, which are available in public places except for museums and exhibitions. And this bill is still slowly moving in our parliament, and what I was particularly impressed with was the opinion of Committee on European Integration, which said that well, this bill would limit the rights of the authors, so it's unconstitutional. It's strange to see this from the people who work with European law in particular, and I believe should know that European Union is considering adding freedom of panorama as a mandatory exception. But that was the solution which is now in process. But in my opinion, certainly it's not the best thing to push for the not a very good quality bill. In my personal opinion, and we are discussing this now with Wikimedia, is that if we push for some amendments to the law, we should push for the right amendments, and I think it's natural in digital era that the freedom of panorama should allow not taking pictures not only of some types of works, but any types of works. Certainly, there are concerns to allow like a broad freedom of panorama. Any works you can reproduce. That's not something which is likely to pass the parliament. So I think that freedom of panorama should allow to take any pictures of like these big works, statues, buildings, and so on, and to allow to take pictures of certain place of any other works which are in public places, but if these works are not the main thing in the photo. However, there is certainly a third solution, but it's like something like let's dream about it. Like to introduce a flexible exception, like for example, like this. But well, that's certainly not something likely to happen. It's just dreaming. Actually, that's all I wanted to say for today, and thank you for your time.